What is going on, guys? I'm Optimus Philip, and I gotta be honest, I kind of enjoyed last week's episode of Percy Jackson. There were still some things that I'm not a huge fan of, but overall, I had a better time watching it than I did the first two episodes. Honestly, I liked it about as much as I liked episode 4 from last season. So, let's discuss. So, the episode begins with Clarice going to see the Oracle, and it feels a little repetitive. It feels almost exactly like the Oracle scene from Season 1, right down to the framing and sequencing of some of the shots. It felt like I was just watching the same episode from Season 1, which, come to think of it, was also the third episode, so yeah, it felt like a direct retread of everything we'd already seen before. I guess it is kind of interesting getting to hear some of Clarice's prophecy from the beginning. That does set up some fun ideas for later, but I wish they'd come up with a better way to do it than just rehashing something we've already seen. We get to see the Princess Andromeda in this episode, and it looks really good. There's this really fun vibe throughout the whole thing, and the mortals look like they're genuinely having fun. They're not in a trance or anything, they just seem to be having a good time. Though I was kind of disappointed that the ship didn't have its masthead. In the book, there was a statue on the prow of the mythological Princess Andromeda, and her story is brought up as an example of the gods being unfair and petty and all that. Basically, she was a princess whose mother offended the gods, so they demanded that she be sacrificed to a sea monster. Perseus came along and saved her, but that whole story does kind of play into Luke's whole motivation. I would have liked to see more of a reference to that. As it is, it feels more like the name is just an Easter egg for those in the know, rather than the big meaningful thing that it was in the book. I also found it a little weird how easily Percy seemed to come around about Annabeth keeping secrets from him. Like in the last episode, he seemed really upset over it, but in this episode, he just comes up with a code word and suddenly everything feels fine to him. I don't know, it doesn't feel like a natural progression from last episode. Like, maybe this plot would have worked a lot better if Annabeth had been the one trying to come up with a workaround. Then Percy could still harbor some resentment, but still understand and appreciate that Annabeth is trying to make things right. I think that would have worked a lot better. The thing that really surprised me about this episode is that when Clarice sets off on her quest, she is going alone just like in the book. Like, Chris is being left behind at camp, which really confused me because I thought that her inviting him on the quest was meant to set something up. You know, that they would run into Luke along the way and Chris would be won over by Luke's argument and join the Titan army, and that would set things up for the later seasons. Like, I'm sure they'll come up with something else to do with Chris and to get him over to the Titan side, but as it is, it felt like they were setting up for something and just didn't follow through with it for some reason. We get a couple scenes with Ares in this episode, which I quite enjoyed. Adam Copeland is really good in this role, and I'm glad to see more of him. Ares didn't have much of a physical presence in the book, he was only in like one brief moment, but he did have a lot of influence over the plot, so including him does make sense. He pretty much just does what he did in the book. He gives Clarice the ship and the crew, so yeah, I think they did a good job here. We also get another scene with Allison in this episode, which was actually pretty interesting. Percy and Annabeth run into her on the Princess Andromeda, and she sort of tries to lure them into a trap, which was fun. They don't quite follow through with it because Percy recognizes her from his vision of Grover, so they get into a fight instead. I think it would have been fun if they had actually gone through with the trap, but what we got is also a lot of fun, so I'm not too upset over that. The scene also ends with Allison just getting thrown overboard, which was honestly pretty funny. I was not expecting that. And for a moment, I was genuinely thinking that she might have died, but I knew that couldn't have been the case because we know she's coming back for later episodes, but for a moment I was like, wow, that was a bit of a turn I was not expecting. Another thing that I wasn't expecting out of this episode was for us to get our first look at a Hellhound. Now, for those who remember my Season 1 videos, I pointed out there that they cut out any mention or appearance of a Hellhound from the book, and I joked that They must have had trouble getting them past standards and practices because, hell is in their name. So I was expecting them to get kind of left out altogether, more or less, but no, we actually get to see what looks like a hellhound in this episode. Now, it's brief, and they never actually say the term hellhound, so they probably are still struggling with that, but it honestly looks pretty cool. It's not as big as it's described in the book, but it looks really cool. It's kind of got this, like, skeletal, fiery look to it. It looks like about how I would imagine a hellhound. I mean, it's a little different from how it's described in the books, but I think it's a lot cooler this way, honestly. They added a subplot to this episode of Clarice learning to be a leader to her crew of zombie sailors, which I actually quite liked. I do like that they're taking advantage of the new medium to explore other characters' perspectives while the books were entirely told from Percy's point of view. I like that. I think that's a good use of the new medium. There is one joke that I'm a little of two minds about. For context, they've expanded Clarice's crew from just being losers of the American Civil War to losers of all wars across history, including a Blockbuster employee who is said to have died during the streaming wars, which, on the one hand, is the kind of absurd joke that you find a lot of in the Percy Jackson books, but at the same time, I can't help but wonder if it's a little too absurd. Like, how do you die during the streaming wars? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I guess it works. It fits the style of humor, so whatever, I did find it funny, so there's that. I guess it's fine. This episode also goes a long way to addressing a concern I had with the ending of Season 1. I mentioned in my inaccuracy video that Annabeth seeing Luke try to kill Percy did kind of go against how it was handled in the book, where she heard that Luke had turned evil, but refused to fully accept it pretty much throughout the series, and that led to a lot of conflict between her and Percy. I was a bit worried at the end of Season 1 that having Annabeth witness his betrayal would undermine that conflict. So far, they're at least trying to make that still work. Annabeth does admit that she feels very betrayed by Luke's having seen him both attack Percy and poison Thalia, but she also does not want to see him dead the way that Percy does, so they're still working that in. It feels a little odd considering, she's been able to see a lot more of what she'd been able to deny in some way in the book, but she still presents good reasoning. She believes that Kronos is manipulating him somehow, and that if they can get him away from Kronos, that they might be able to get him to see reason again. So, yeah, I think that at least could work, so I'm feeling a lot better about that. I also really like how this episode is handling the character of Luke in general. Like, they're playing him up as a much more genuine character, like more like he's actually fighting for something he believes in and is just misguided, rather than being outright evil like he came across as in the books. In fact, I feel like this reinterpretation of Luke could go a long way to justifying the existence of Allison. Like, my favorite scenes with her in this episode where she's in the scene with Luke and sort of embodying the more villainous aspects of his character that he had in the book, while the show seems to be playing up his more tragic side. I think that if that's the idea, to sort of make Luke seem more redeemable while still allowing the more villainous moments to come through Allison, I think that could be a lot of fun. I think that does work. Hopefully they lean more into that angle as the show goes on, rather than, going into the pitfalls I mentioned in the last video. So, yeah, I'm honestly excited to see where they take this dynamic, and if it all pays off. So, yeah, those were basically my thoughts on episode 3. So now let's all pull up our bingo cards and see what we can mark off today. So this week we only have 2 squares to mark off. No Scythian Dracene, and no Bear Twin backstory, because the Bear Twins don't appear in this episode at all. Yeah, the only monsters on the Princess Andromeda are the Hellhound that I mentioned and the Lystragonians that we saw in episode 1. So yeah, those are the only squares we're marking off this week. I only had one, but you might have both. I don't know if this is going to be enough to get anyone a bingo this week, but if we do, again, post it in the Discord server and I'll give you a shout out next time. And until then, this has been Optimus Philip, rolling out.